Welcome back to Talent Take 5. I'm Andrew Sterling. If you're in HR leadership right now, I know retention is always top of mind. People are disengaged, top performers are quietly looking around, and honestly, a lot of the usual fixes just aren't cutting it anymore. Today, I'm talking with Chuck Mollor. He is CEO of MCG Partners here in Boston. Chuck is also the author of The Rise of the Agile Leader, and he co-founded Lead, a group of over 400 CEOs who meet quarterly to work through real business problems. Chuck's been doing this for over 30 years. He works with Predictive Index on behavioral assessments, and he's going to share what he's working on to keep people engaged and help teams reduce turnover. Chuck, great to have you on the show, and always great to see you.
Thanks, Andrew. We're always good to see you. Always good to have a conversation.
Absolutely. So Chuck, as I said, you've been in the space for a long time. For the audience, if they don't know you, walk me through how you got here and what led you to really focus on leadership development and talent optimization.
Yeah, I've been in consulting really most of my career. I probably spent about 7 years in corporate because I really wanted to understand the inside of a company and how it worked. And my role there was in financial services, sort of the late 80s, early 90s, where I started before that in consulting, and then went back into consulting. And I did a lot of work around transformation and managing change and mergers and acquisitions and selling off businesses. That was kind of my corporate background. My consulting background is a combination of strategy, change management, and then I fell into the sort of leadership development, talent management space. And that's what I kind of knew I found my calling. And I ended up running a global practice, and actually before that, I had built a couple of businesses for other people, and I was running global practice and got pulled in to the office by my CEO one day who said, have you ever had a 360 assessment? And of course I said, why? Which was a kind of a silly question. There's a reason why. And long story short, I got some really tough feedback, and, I wasn't prepared for it. I thought I was self-aware. I had very little self-awareness, obviously, because I was shocked by the feedback I received. And, I had a very good boss who was also a mentor, which is rare as your boss. And he said, look, you're always going to be successful. You're smart. You get results. You care about people. But if you want to get to the next level of your career, including maybe being a CEO one day, you really have to understand the leadership part of your job, not just the management part of your job. So I went away, reflected, came back and said, you're right. And that really started my journey, Andrew. And that was about around 1999 in terms of really understanding what leadership was for me personally. And that's a journey I have not stopped. And a year later, I was actually promoted to CEO and ran a global firm and grew that pretty substantially. And then 2006, we got acquired twice in 1 year. And then I started MCG Partners in 2007, where I knew I wanted to be in the leadership development, organizational effectiveness space. I knew I wanted to build a team, but I also decided at that point I was going to become an executive coach. So I kind of wrote my own job description where I would coach executives and executive teams and at the same time build a practice of really talented people. And I've been very fortunate. So MCG Partners has been in business now for over 18 and a half years. So that's been kind of my journey, and and I'm still learning. I'm still on that
Great.
journey, Andrew. So yeah,
I love that. And it's interesting where a lot of your sort of coming to the, leading companies and really ramping up your own trajectory in your career started with this lightning bolt moment of self-awareness. And now you're working with CEOs to coach them. And I'm sure self-awareness is a big topic. So how are you still living some of that lesson that you learned that was a really hard thing? Because I think it is tough. It's tough to take constructive feedback and to seek it out often, right? And have a feedback loop. So I'm curious how you still are doing that work and how you leverage that work with your clients and executives that you work with.
yeah, it's a great question. I think you're right. Self-awareness is a foundation. Without self-awareness, without feedback from your key stakeholders on how you show up with people, how you interact, how you influence, how you develop, how you collaborate, all those key, qualities and characteristics, how you deal with conflict. There's so many of those characteristics. So the combination of feedback and insight and input, but also understanding yourself, and you mentioned it earlier in the beginning of the introduction, your behavioral self. Do you really understand who you are, what motivates and drives you? And there's many people probably listening to this who've probably have had either good experiences or not good experiences, depending on who they've worked with, about what a behavioral assessment is and why it could be really impactful. We like to use, as you already mentioned, Predictive Index or PI, because it really translates really effectively into who you are naturally as a leader. It kind of describes your natural leadership and management style. And frankly, both are important, and we make a real big distinction between both. But leadership effectiveness is not just about behavior, and yes, it's about feedback, but it's really understanding how to think of leadership and management as a craft in itself. We all come out of a functional background, and we're all very, very driven to want to be successful. And it's a really important shift and moment when you realize not how to try to prove how successful and smart and great you are to everyone around you, but realizing how much you need to learn, how much you don't know. I kind of described that, my 20s and 30s and probably my early 40s as trying to convince everybody how great I was. And all of a sudden I realized how much I didn't really know. But it's also the shift of, understanding it's not about you anymore. If you really want to summarize leadership in a lot of ways, it's really about helping the world around you be successful. It's not really about you anymore.
So you talk a lot about, you wrote a book on the rise of the agile leader.
Right.
For those that don't know, how do you define what agile really means? Because I think it gets thrown around and sometimes your definition might change. So how do you define it?
Yeah, no, great question. It's not as a hot topic as it used to be, but for many years, over 20 years, agile was really a methodology that came out of software development. It was really about improving the cycle of innovation. This whole methodology of agile kind of came out. And so sometimes people confuse that with the book and the title, The Agile Leader. So we use the word agile as a verb. So agile, meaning your ability to be flexible, your ability to shift, your ability to be adaptable, really. Now, ironically, our agile leadership model, which is what where the agile leader, came from, fits into the agile methodology and the agile world very, very well. But yeah, so the history of the book was, and we ended up, my publisher actually convinced me to use the word agile because we were kind of struggling about how we want to describe this leadership model. But the history was, I really went to my team, whatever it was now, 6 years ago, to say, hey, what's the future of leadership? Leadership's changing. I really felt like there really isn't a model out there that's really encompassing, capturing the qualities that leaders really need to demonstrate to be effective in the business world today. So we did our research. We talked to CEOs, we talked to executive teams, we looked at research that was out there, and then we came up with this leadership model that we coined the Agile Leader. And that became the motivation to write the book. But the book in itself is also a roadmap for any leader at any level about how do I get to the next level? What are those key characteristics? What are those key skills, knowledge, and strategies that I need to encompass to be able to be effective and kind of get to that next level of effectiveness and in my career? So that's what the leadership book is about.
So I'm curious to dive into some of the framework there, because it seems like there's some major driving factors. And when you're walking into a company, one that's maybe losing people or their leadership team is struggling
Yeah.
with burnout or retention, or whatever the issue might be, how do you assess that, right? You're dealing with assessments a lot, but how do you sort of assess where there's and diagnose where there's problems to sort of kick things off, and how you frame it in some of your coaching work?
So I always try to connect the 50,000 foot level, sort of strategic viewpoint with the practical, down on the streets aspect of what does it look like on a practical day-to-day basis. So let's start at the 50,000 foot level first, Andrew. I always talk about, and I speak about this a lot at conferences and with executive teams and offsites, even podcasts, which is you have to start really about the impact of leadership. And you as an organization, what do you mean by leadership? How do you define leadership? And what are you doing to make sure that you're developing, aligning your whole organization so they actually understand uh, the expectation and the skills required to demonstrate effective leadership in your organization? So that's number one. Now, why? Well, we talk about culture often. We talk about employee engagement often, right? You've mentioned already a couple of times in this. And We already know there's 20, 30 years of hard research by many organizations that show the higher engaged your organization is, the higher your financial performance is, right? There's research that's confirmed that over 20 years now. So we know that as an organization, you want to drive high engagement. Well, what creates engagement? There's a number of things, but the primary drivers, and again, this is research based, it's not just my opinion, is leadership effectiveness, your ability to hire, develop, onboard, and create career opportunities and inspire and coach and develop and give proper feedback to your employees drives engagement. And what does that look like at his organization? Your culture. Your culture essentially is your brand that should reflect your external brand of why do you want to work here? What's the employee experience going to be? How are we going to treat you in terms of how we make decisions, how we reward you, how we recognize you, and how we manage you? That's your culture. And that culture is reflected on very specific values that most organizations communicate either on their intranets or on their websites or within or internal organizations. The key is to make sure that you have systems and processes in your organization that allow people to see the connection between your values and how people are, again, developed, recognized, advanced, and so on. So this whole connection at the 50,000 foot level between leadership, engagement, and culture is really, really critical. And then on a very practical level, which we can talk about, is really how do you do that? What does that really look like? And that's where development programs, succession programs, are critical for an organization to truly invest in leadership and make sure that there is a consistency of what you mean by leadership so you can drive engagement, drive culture, which drives financial performance.
I'm curious your reaction to something that jumped out at me. We're talking about engagement a lot, and
Yeah.
so much of disengagement comes down to direct managers, right? It might be, you know, 70% of engagement issues probably is tied to issues with direct management. And it's all well and good if some of this messaging is being absorbed by your C-suite, but how do you sort of downstream effect where there's a lot of probably underlying issues with some of your culture, right? That's manifesting with maybe bad management at the line level, sort of down the further down the org chart. You mentioned some of the processes and things that you might put in place. What would you recommend if you feel if like a CEO says, I feel like we're doing a lot on our ELT to impact change and really introduce some of these principles of being an agile leader, but there's some brokenness downstream.
Yeah, it's a really complex and complicated situation because there's so much inconsistency. So let me give you some very specific examples. We often see executive teams say, yes, we need manager training, we need leadership development, but everyone below us, okay? And it's like, well, no, it's got to start at the top because if your top executive team don't demonstrate they're invested and they realize they need to be able to put a stake in the ground and say, how are we going to show up? How are we going to demonstrate effective leadership and management? And they need to continue to do that, to your point, at the domino effect throughout your organization. So, and by the way, a lot of us just assume that this is happening, that development is happening. I literally had a conversation with a well-known company, mid-sized company yesterday, where they literally have not had management leadership development in 3 years. So we automatically assume that companies are invested in developing that. And yes, I would say a good portion of the Fortune 500 continue to do that. But you're also pointing out something that happens, which is the disconnect between the development, how managers are managing and leading, and what's the development of those managers when they're not effective. How are they being held accountable? Where is that? And we already know, you mentioned top performers. We're going to talk about churn a little bit in a minute. But the first thing that top performers do when they see bad leadership and bad management and not being addressed, no different than a colleague of theirs who's not performing and that not being addressed, what do? They leave or they become disengaged. So if you want to lower engagement, you don't address poor performance and you don't address poor management and poor leadership. You're literally driving your engagement and your productivity down when you're not addressing that. So it's a combination of both. Are you truly invested in developing all your managers and leaders? Or is your executive team walking the talk? Are they demonstrating what effective leadership and management is? Have you even taken the time to define what you mean by leadership as an organization? And then, accountability seems like to be often a bad word. Holding people accountable is not about beating people up or just firing them on the spot. It's about saying, we have a challenge, there's a need, here's some feedback, and here's how we're going to develop that. And here's a time frame of how we're going to help you develop that. So accountability's got to be shared. It's got to be both the person that's involved in development, whoever that person's boss is, and the organization's support in helping develop that person. Because how you handle non-performance or bad behavior is just as critical as how you reward top performers. People pay attention. They want to know, is that person going to be given the benefit of the doubt? And oh, by the way, are you then going to make a decision? Because if you don't make a decision, if you allow bad behavior and bad performance to linger, again, great way of disengaging your people and having your people leave.
How do you understand the people that you've even got to fix if there's an engagement problem, right? I mean, so much of this could be at the desk level, individual contributors that might be very high performing or high potential, but getting at the development is something that I think is got to be a concern if you're going to make an investment. And maybe that's kind of where some of the, personality testing comes in, because if you're going to develop people, how do you know who they are at their core to figure out how to get the most out of them, get the best out of them, to your point, to kind of reframe some of that accountability, right? Because that's the end goal. And I think this might lead into some of the churn that we're talking about, where, I'm sure you've seen some dramatic differences in companies that take the time to assess their employee population versus those that don't. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Think about this on a very practical level. When you understand not just a person from a personality or behavioral standpoint, the key is what motivates and drives them. How do they show up and approach their work? How do they show up as a member of a team? When you have that insight, which is what a tool like PI does, you have that within 7 minutes instantly. It's a 2.5-page report. It's very concise. And once you understand that about your people, because again, motivating and inspiring people and getting the most out of your people, it's about understanding who that person is. And every person's unique. There's no such thing as taking one management or leadership theory and applying it to everybody, right? To get people to get them to be their optimal self is you really need to understand each person individually. Using a tool like P allows you to do that. And it really is an effective management tool, because once you understand the makeup of your person and how to manage that person in their unique way, that allows you to get them to be as engaged as possible, as well as what's the makeup of my team. So the ability to do team analytics in addition to individual analytics, that becomes such a powerful management tool to understand that. Honestly, I wish I had that earlier in my career. It would have saved me a lot of head pounding against brick walls, both for myself individually, but also myself as a manager, leader of people.
I think you can learn quite a bit from just people's tendencies and priorities. And what are some of the biggest things that you enjoy the most about the insights that you can glean from a PI as you guys are implementing it? What do you find the most impactful?
Yeah, I think once you can really understand how a person deals with change, how they deal with risk, how they deal with conflict, how assertive they are. So very specific examples would be, some of us are, and these are literally things that are captured and measured in a behavioral assessment like PI. Some of us are big change agents. Some of us see change as a threat. Some of us are very, very patient. Some of us are very intense and hard charge and like to multitask, where some of us are very methodical and like to do repetitive responsibilities and tasks. Some of us are very trusting naturally, and some of us are very skeptical. And most of us know the extroversion piece. That's probably the best behavioral capture that almost everyone has grown up learning, right? Some of us are extroverted or are
Yep.
very connecting. Some of us are more reserved, more analytical, a little bit more skeptical. So once you understand the characteristics of people and how people interact. So for example, if you're a driver, if you're assertive, you're highly opinionated, but you like to have ownership, you like to be in charge, but you like to make things happen, go through walls, and you also like to be right, right? We call that healthy debate, right? When two people are butting heads. Now, someone who's the opposite of that, who's more not individualistic. They're more collaborative. They're more harmonistic. They're more about the team versus themselves. They're not as assertive. They're more just easygoing. They're happy to be part of a team. They don't need to be in charge. Doesn't mean they don't have opinions. Doesn't mean they don't want to sometimes own projects. That's just more their natural self. Now, when it comes to conflict, people who are more like that tend to be more conflict averse. They tend to, if they're in a room with a lot of, we call those type A personalities, right? We're in a room of highly assertive people who have strong opinions. We've all been in rooms like this. The people tend to be quiet. They tend not to say much. And if those highly dominant, assertive people don't take the time to ask questions to people, especially people who are not saying much, because they either are processing, either low in extroversion or they're low in dominance, meaning they're more, again, unassuming, more harmonistic, and they don't like conflict. So once you understand that, you're able to facilitate conversations in a room differently. Because here's what happens. At the end of that conversation, let's call it the debate or the discussion, that person in charge thinks, hey, everybody's on board. We're all aligned. Then everybody walks out of the meeting. And then 2 days later, you hear whispers of the people who don't like conflict telling everybody how much they disagreed with the decision. Why? Because we call that passive behavior, passive aggressive behavior, right? They're more comfortable explaining and venting outside of a pressure conflict situation. So that's a good example, a very practical example that once you understand how people are wired, that people are naturally like that way. They're not trying to be that way. That's who they naturally are. You're able to navigate and facilitate conversations and decisions differently. I mean, in my own team, I've got people that are very, very diverse, not just in terms of roles and skills and responsibilities, but also behaviorally, and including the dynamic of highly assertive and not assertive. So once you understand that, you're able to manage differently. You're able to lead differently. You're able to make decisions differently and include people in conversations differently. So that's a very, very practical, real example that we've all experienced. But there's a tool like PI that can actually capture that and give you an understanding of where people are in that spectrum.
So you work with a lot of CEOs, and I think a lot of what we were just talking about is so applicable. And if you're an executive that has engagement issues, kind of getting at some of those fundamental understanding of who you're working with, I think is great. But what about from what you see working with CEOs where maybe there's conflict at the C-suite level?
Right.
You've got some really smart people, very strong opinions. And if there is a dysfunction at the ELT level, like that's a big, big problem. So I'm curious your reaction to what you're hearing from CEOs that feel like there might be conflict at the top of the org chart within people within the executive teams. Like, does the same principle still apply even at that level?
Yeah. Again, I love that question because sometimes the assumption is everyone at the C level are all highly assertive alpha personalities.
Right.
That
Right.
is not the case.
Yep.
Yes, sometimes in certain industries and certain companies, they have a reputation for that, right? It goes back to cultures. Some cultures are known for being kind of alpha cultures, or leadership teams are known for being alpha. Don't be wrong, you still see a pretty large percentage of executives having that kind of characteristic. And you're right, sometimes conflict can get in the way if it's not properly managed. One of the bigger issues is really the turnover sort of trend we're seeing at the executive level. And that's a whole nother issue. But you're right. I mean, at the executive level, and it depends really on because like the CEO sets the tone. They just do. And you'd be surprised. There are a lot of CEOs that are not that assertive, where they either don't want to deal with the conflict or they're passive aggressive themselves, or they don't set the tone about what is expected or what are the boundaries as an executive team of how we're going to make decisions, how we agree to disagree. So it is an issue, especially when you're having a lot of turnover at the C level or leadership in general, is how do we better understand the makeup of the members of the executive team so that we are able to make decisions more effectively. We're communicating more effectively. We're dealing with change and risk effectively. And of course, we're dealing with conflict effectively. But you're right, the most executive teams have a problem with conflict, but what ends up happening, even with assertive people, because they don't want to deal with the conflict, they just shut down. And that's not effective. If you can't get your opinion on the table because you feel you're going to get shot down or because there's so many alphas in the room and they're going to disagree and they're going to shoot you down. That's not healthy either. So there's got to be boundaries. There has to be parameters, sort of rules of engagement almost of how we're going to discuss and make decisions and how we show up effectively to make those decisions.
That's a great point. And you talk about conflict, and I think that one of the biggest conflicts, and this exists from entry level up to executive, is a sort of internal conflict of burnout. And I love to dive into some of that because that creates a massive problem with engagement and huge costs to companies to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars annually, creating issues with the workforce. So I'm curious what your perception is on burnout in the workforce right now, right? I think there's been a lot of this. There was quiet quitting. The new one is quiet cracking. Love to get your reaction to what that even means. But because I think that's one of the unspoken conflicts that's manifesting, I think, in every company right now.
Yeah, I'm smiling only because of the name. I mean, no, I mean, the issue of burnout or cracking is real, and that's not funny. COVID really kind of took it to another level. I mean, there's been burnout and people sort of cracking at the seams for forever. And if anything, especially in this country, we have this culture of work, becoming a higher priority. And then we add the cost of living factors. And then just culturally as a country, we are very work oriented, unlike other cultures where work is really secondary in a lot of ways. It's everything from how much time we take off and what we do with our time off and, all those things. And I think, unfortunately, even though with COVID, virtual work, hybrid work became a reality and we're still there. And yes, there's still the debate of the pros and cons of being in office versus hybrid. We could spend a lot of time on that. But I still think it is a significant issue. I addressed a little bit in the book, actually. I wrote my book before COVID. It came out during COVID. But I think where you spend time, depending on, I call it the four quadrants, right? There's yourself, there's your family and friends, there's your job, and there's your community. And they're not equal, and they're never going to be equal all the time. But are you spending enough time? And for most leaders, and this does come up, by the way, with almost everybody. If you're not taking care of yourself, it's hard to take care of the world around you. And taking care of yourself is not just about, your quality of life in terms of how many hours you work and how much time you're spending with your family and friends. It's also your mental, your emotional, and your physical health. Everything from sleep to what you eat. And yeah, that's not kind of traditional coaching or leadership development. And not to say that's a primary thing we talk about, but for coaching, I can honestly say almost everyone I work with over the last 5 years, that's come up in conversation. So it's a real problem. I've had conversations with heads of human resources, with CEOs, about how do we deal with burnout. And as you probably know, the ramp up of mental health programs, of additional benefits, health benefits in companies today become a huge, huge focus in corporations today because of that. And that one of the downsides of virtual is the isolation. We as people need connection. We need to get together with people. And it's easy to start isolating yourself. And then when you add, and it gets compounded between social media and our cell phones and being wired 24/7 to social media and our television. So, there's so many aspects to that, Andrew, right? But it has to start with you. And that's for everybody, whether you're a leader or not. You have to ask your question, am I doing enough for myself, mentally, physically, emotionally, in terms of my health? And depending on what's important to you, what do I need to shift in terms of allowing myself to kind of find that healthy balance, whatever balance means for you specifically, depending on what your goals and what motivates and drives you. But yes, mental health, burnout is a huge issue right now.
If you're a CEO that's grappling with burnout on teams, if you're getting feedback that a lot of the engagement issues are tied into burnout, I think what's tied closely into the idea of being burnt out is the need for this other phrase that gets thrown around a lot is psychological safety. And I know you've spoken about this before. How do you explain to a CEO what that is? Especially if that's like, to use your, if it's an alpha CEO that might think that sounds soft, right? But we know that there's an issue with burnout. How are those things related? And is that something that CEOs and executive teams should be thinking about?
So, yeah, let's talk about psychological safety. And I always try to bring a very practical way of describing psychological safety. But I want to add another thing before I talk about that, which is part of the burnout issue is recognizing that you need to give your staff realistic goals and objectives and responsibilities. I mean, there's so much pressure on reducing headcount, reducing cost. We've seen a lot of restructures and layoffs over the last, it's becoming a norm, right? Every year, right? We saw a huge surge in the fourth quarter of this past year, and again in the beginning of this year as well. And by the way, for your managers and leaders who are now managing in the most complex world we've ever seen, including in corporate and businesses today, are you giving enough time to manage? A lot of these managers are individual contributors. So how are you expecting to really manage effectively if they're also being an individual contributor? So part of the issue is, are we giving realistic expectations to people doing their jobs in some of these businesses? So that's one point. But psychological safety, it's not the best frame of capturing what it is. The theory behind it is absolutely amazing. And if you know anything of the book and the research that came out of it, it was someone who's very well known, who actually was observing why there were deaths in hospitals in this one particular hospital. The end result was that nurses were afraid to challenge the doctors, even when they were wrong in prescribing wrong medication or diagnosing incorrectly. And they actually knew that they were wrong. And what's scary is they were afraid of being reprimanded, losing their jobs, and wouldn't challenge the doctors. So that's where it came out of. And so psychological safety essentially is creating a work environment where people are not threatened or feel that they're going to get shot down if they challenge the status quo, if they say, I disagree, or if they have an idea. So if you're trying to, again, drive engagement, if you're trying to create a work environment where people feel appreciated and valued, by the way, the number one criteria, am I valued and appreciated as an employee? Well, part of that is, do people feel they have a voice? Do people feel they have ideas? People feel like, I think this is, we're doing this wrong, or there's a risk or a threat to the business, like that nurse example. So when you talk that language to a CEO, they get it. They get, yeah, that makes sense to me. And by the way, there's another aspect to this, innovation. How do you create innovation internally as an organization, improve internal processes and systems and operations, but create new services, new products, new solutions for your customers in your market if you don't create an environment where it's okay to fail, it's okay to make a mistake? Because if you don't create that, what's going to happen? And no, we don't have probably time today, but I use very often, case stories, real case stories and studies of both sides. With CEOs, how they respond to failure or mistake. Again, there's acceptable levels of failure mistakes and unacceptable, right? So it's not like you accept all failure mistakes, but how you respond to individuals and teams when they fail and make a mistake, that's critical to how they're motivated to try again. Because think about it, you don't create innovation without failure. I mean, there's plenty of examples. One of the more famous ones, Bill Gates, right? He failed like 7 companies before he got it right. Besides getting into, how that actually all happened. The point is, you don't become innovative. You don't create new things without failing and making mistakes. So there's an innovation aspect to this, in addition to having people feel they're not going to get reprimanded, lose their job because they're challenging the status quo, or they're pointing out something that could be at risk for the organization.
There's an important distinction too between failure and making mistakes, which I'd argue like you've got to break stuff. There's a lot of thinking around, break it as quickly as you can and refine to get at better outcomes. But there's a distinction between that, but also poor performance, which I think is, if we talk about that sort of quiet cracking that's going on where, even some of your best people might start to break, and how do we catch this early? I think it's especially a problem that's manifesting with Gen Z, which is a unique demographic, right? I mean, it's growing up with smartphones and social media, which is not the case for most of the millennials and previous generations. So I think this poor performance culture too is sort of different though than making mistakes. I'm curious at getting at better engagement and fixing some of that problem. as it relates to poor, like true poor performance? What's your reaction and how a company might go about fixing that?
Yeah, I think that there's so many components of that. One of it is actually the clarity on what success is for that individual, both in terms of their goals and objectives, the progress they make throughout a given year, and your ability to give that person feedback and provide development, coaching and development and training to do their job effectively. And as well as, by the way, how they show up as a member of a team, as an employee. And again, a lot of managers are not effective at doing that, not effective at goal setting. They're not effective at giving feedback. They're not effective at sitting down and making sure that often you have to, I use like the word recalibrate. Sometimes, I literally had this conversation with a very senior executive of a big organization yesterday. He's got some challenges. And, you know, there's an adage, which is I've never seen an executive make a decision too quickly on poor performance. It's always the opposite. We always wait too long.
Mm,
You know,
100%.
but you have to give that person a chance. As I said earlier, everyone's paying attention how you handle poor performers. Are you going to sit down with them? Are you going to first ask them how do they think they do? Because there are a lot of poor performers who think they're doing a great job. Now, and your job as a good manager or leader is to ask them to self-assess. How are they doing? What progress they making? Where do they think they're doing well? Where do they think they're not doing well, they're struggling with? So once you get them to self-assess, now you have a sort of bench of where they see themselves. And then as a manager, you have to have honest, courageous dialogue that's still supportive, that's still empathetic. You don't have to be harsh, you don't have to be abrasive, you don't have to be cold. You have to be able to say, let's talk about kind of where you see yourself and where I see you are. And let's talk about where is that going to look? What is success specifically going to mean, both in terms of how you show up as a member of a team and how you do your job? And what are those key interval objectives and metrics and how you progress over a period of time? And then we're going to sit down in 30, 60, 90 days, whatever is appropriate to say, let's see where we are. And then you have to make a decision. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Because most managers want that person to succeed. Most of them are rooting for them.
Agreed.
Most of us see the potential, but we have to have those honest conversations, and not hide behind performance reviews and hide behind layoffs and reduction of forces when people are not performing.
Would you agree with the sentiment that what you tolerate, you encourage?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and unfortunately, if you're tolerating things that you should not be tolerating, you're sending all the wrong messages to your best people. And that, as I said earlier, that's critical. Your best people want to be in an organization where the standards are high, both from a performance standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, meaning how you show up, how you treat people, how you interact with people. And as a manager, you have to hold the line when people are not showing up or not behaving and not performing at a certain level. And you have to know how to handle that and manage that effectively. You should do it with grace. You should do it with compassion. You should do it with respect. But you've got to be able to have those conversations. And the longer you wait, the harder it gets, and more the problem escalates and festers.
It's great stuff. You've spent a lot of time with CEOs. I get asked a lot from heads of HR, and one topic that's always, on people's minds is what are priorities of CEOs right now? I mean, we have a landscape. We were talking before the podcast started on some of the AI changes and things as we look at our workforces amidst this constantly shifting landscape and funding being a question and where do we spend money, right? A lot of the purse strings being tightened lately. From some of the work that you've been doing with Lead, the group that you're involved in, feel free to speak a little bit about that.
Sure.
Love to hear more about that, but also what you're hearing as far as priorities from CEOs. I think it's absolutely a the managing of an employee population, having high performing teams is great, but what else is on some of the CEOs' minds that you're
Yeah, I mean, AI is definitely a huge topic right now, right? We were talking before we got on the air, and it's disrupting businesses today. CEOs are thinking about how do we become innovative, how do we become more effective and leaner leveraging AI. So it is having an impact in terms of the workforce and how the workforce is being hired and how they're adding to headcount or even reducing headcount, how AI is actually replacing roles in companies today. So, and also from an innovative standpoint, how do we supplement our services or provide products and solutions that have an AI component to it? So that's a deep rabbit hole in itself. So AI is top of mind. Yes, culture and leadership are critical because, most CEOs definitely recognize that if we don't have the right work environment, if we don't have strong leadership, we're not going to attract top talent. We're not going to keep top talent. And if we don't do that, we're not going to execute. We're not going to reach our goals. We're not going to satisfy our shareholders and our financial objectives and strategic objectives. So that is top of mind of organizations. Then, clearly your ability to be innovative. How do we continue to make sure we stay ahead of the curve in terms of being competitive, no matter what our sector is? Now, clearly, if you're a nonprofit, innovation means a little bit different than if you're a software company, if you're a biotech company or life sciences. So your industry has a lot to do with that. But focusing on your existing customers, understanding your customers, retaining and obviously leveraging your customers, that's always top of mind for a CEO. But the other thing that's top of mind is also the fact, how do I have an effective executive team? And, as we were saying earlier, there's a lot of turnover right now, not just in companies overall, but especially at executive teams, especially at leadership teams. And that in itself is creating a lot of disruption. Now, how do I create a high performing executive team that's aligned, that can make effective decisions, that can be aligned on strategy when an executive is leaving every year, that 7 or 9 person executive team? Often there are 2, 3 new people every year on an executive team. That creates huge impact, especially at the CEO level, because every CEO brings their own style, their own personality, brings their own sort of definition of what they mean by leadership, how they like to make decisions, how they like to manage their executive teams. And it has a trickle down effect. So that in itself creates substantial disruption in an organization when you have that kind of turnover.
I think CEOs should be thinking about how do we create an optimal leadership function in these organizations, and maybe a good way for us to start to wrap this up and talking about what you are working on now, Chuck. Obviously, coming off of the heels of a very successful book, Amazon bestseller with The Rise of the Agile Leader. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and your upcoming project.
Yeah. So as we were talking about right before we got on the air here, I am starting a second book. Been thinking about it the last couple of years, and almost a 2.0 version from the first book, but in itself will be very unique with all new material. And right now the title is going to be called, no pun intended, since we're talking about being optimal, but it is going to be called The Optimal Leader: Mastering Your Impact. So the focus really about what is optimal, and when you think about the business climate today and how we forecast the future, and this whole notion of tying it into impact, right? Because at the end of the day, it is about impact, strategically, financially, culturally. And again, as we already talked about, the employees we have in the organization today, they're unique, the different generations and what they've grown up with. So there's so much complexity for managers and leaders today more than ever. The pace of change continues to accelerate at a really all-time high. We're still in the early stage of the impact of AI. There's so much to deal with right now. So yeah, I'm pretty excited by it. I've written a couple of blogs recently, one about the CEO kind of dilemma about today, and that's sort of a insight to some of the things we'll be talking about in the new book.
Very excited for that, Chuck, and thank you for this. Really valuable, and I think what stands out to me is thinking about this sort of mindset shift from how do I keep people to how do we develop the leaders that are on the team that become sort of magnets for people that want to be work that you want to work with. And I think you've got a lot of great examples of things and actionable insights and steps that people can take. Really great stuff. And thank you so much. So for the folks that are listening, where should people go to learn more about what you're doing and some of the work that your team is doing as well?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Andrew. Probably the best way, if you want to learn more about us, is our website, which is mcgpartners.com. You can always reach me on LinkedIn. It's Chuck Mollor, Mollor. So that's an easy way to find me. Happy to respond to any emails or calls. if people have any questions or want to discuss any of this further.
Fantastic. Well, Chuck, thank you so much for joining me here on Talent Take 5. If this was helpful, please subscribe to the channel. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, so you can catch the next one. And of course, if you're hiring HR leadership or looking to really improve the talent that's around you on your teams, find me as well on LinkedIn, and happy to chat through strategy with that. So Chuck, thank you again. Appreciate you doing this. Thanks for listening, folks. And again, I'm Andrew Sterling, and we'll see you next time here on Talent Take 5.
I'm the one you should be giving your attention to.